Hi everyone, Dennis Monokroussos here, and we're going to continue looking at some viewer games. And we left off, I believe last time, looking at a game between Spreek and IW, and that was in the kamikaze variation of the Caro-Kann. There was this kind of relation to the exchange variation of the Caro-Kann, and there is a reason why I'm actually showing you that opening very, very briefly. So remember, after knight to e5, the idea was to play bishop to b5 check, and black played a6. And one of the things I said is that this is a bit of an overreaction to the bishop to b5 check possibility. It's worth black's while to pay attention to it, but it doesn't really have to make such a radical, well, essentially loss of a tempo to deal with it. So something like knight to d7 and then g6 is satisfactory. So with the knight on d7 rather than on c6, bishop to b5 really doesn't pack much of a wallop, and so black should be fine here. Okay, so let's turn to our first game for this week, or our first new game for this week, played between Krumov or Krumov, depending on his nationality, and a player, very well-known player named NN, Nominissio, so Latin for basically anonymous. So this is a game 15 event, and white went on to win this game, but was curious if he missed something easier along the way. So we won't look at the full game, but we'll look at enough to see something that he could have done to win much more easily. Okay, so we have a Slav, and then knight to c3. Unless you have something really specific plan in mind in some kind of gambit line, knight to f3 seems like an easier way to play. It just makes for fewer problems when you're trying to regain the pawn, unless you like these gambit lines. But anyway, so knight to c3, it's fine, but just got to know what you're doing, that's all. So d takes c4, a4, and here black decided to hold on to the pawn. But I think simply e5 is actually a pretty effective way to play. Though, again, there's theory on this, and it's, something if you know it and you like it, great, but do know about that move. Anyway, black played bishop to e6, white played e4, and here black played knight to a6. And I guess he's hoping to play knight to b4 and maybe knight to d3 check to try to grab the bishop here. Not really sure that it makes all that much sense to develop in this way here, but okay, let's carry on. White played logically, pushing forth with d5. Takes, bishop takes c4, and knight to b4. And, okay, so knight to c2 check is a threat, and if white plays bishop to b3, then knight to d3 check is at least a little bit of an annoyance. But white simply plays bishop to b5 check here, and now it's not really clear that the knight is that well placed on b4. I mean, in some ways it's almost stranded out there. So, okay, black has to play bishop to d7, white played knight to f3, and here black played a poor move, f6. And the reason why I showed the previous game is because it's relevant here. I think in both cases, the player with black was too worried about this combination of white playing knight to e5 and bishop to b5. So in the previous game, white had played knight to e5 and was at least kind of hinting at playing bishop to b5. Here, white's played bishop to b5 and maybe was getting ready to play knight to e5. In both cases, I think black's reaction was excessive, especially here, because now this e6 square is just mouth-wateringly delicious, and white's pieces should strive to get there as fast as possible. So here, in a blitz game, in a slow game, probably whatever game, I would play knight to d4, with the idea, of course, of embedding this knight on e6, and causing black's whole position to suffer from gangrene. So what should black have done instead? Well, if he takes the bishop, I think this isn't that great, because after a takes b5, this knight on b4 is in danger of something bad happening to it. So black can play knight to f6, and here actually take a moment and see if you can figure out what white's move should do. So it's kind of a neat idea here. Well, the answer, I think, is b6. So this is kind of clever. If black takes on d5, then white takes and then plays or captures on a7. actually may even play queen a4 check first in some lines. So this this looks certainly uncomfortable for black if he takes on d5. And if he plays a takes b6, then we can swap and castle. And here black has some more difficulty. So again, his king's undeveloped. I mean, his king side is all basically at home except for the knight. And his knight on b4 is a little bit loose. So this is a very tough position for black to play. So I don't think that's really the way to go either. But best, I think, is just knight to f6. So there's no real reason for an overreaction. We simply develop. We pressure the pawn on d5. White's still a little bit better, yes, but it's not an overwhelming advantage. Anyway, black played f6, and white did not immediately capitalize with knight to d4. But the thing is, black, thanks to f6, just has really a chronically bad position. So just good, healthy moves by white are going to ensure a nice advantage, whether it's a crushing advantage or just a very pleasant one. So white castled, which is a pretty good move in its own right. a6, takes, queen to b3, knight to d3. And here, too, okay, I think white has a way to achieve a really big advantage with just nice natural moves. So black has only one active piece, the knight obviously, and if we swap it off, then black has nothing really going for him. It's just very tough for black. I mean, he can't play e6 because it loses a pawn, and also it opens the board, which is going to be suicidal for him with his king in the center. He can play g6, bishop g7, and knight h6, and then try to castle, but that's kind of slow, and white should be able to punish him long before he gets there. So I think the best move here is knight to e4, and this does several things. So first of all, it pretty much forces black to take. Okay, but now after rook a to c1, we've developed another piece. The knight is ready to go to c5 and again to e6, or perhaps take on b7. Okay, probably better to play the greedy move on, or not to play the greedy move, but to stick the knight on e6. But we could even take the pawn. So we've brought a rook to this open file, which could also be usable. And maybe in some variations too, we might stop this g6 development, because rook f to e1, and there may be various tricks involving this pin here. So black's position is really bad. For instance, knight h6, knight c5, queen d6, and now we could take on b7, but just piling up is really strong. So let's say b6, knight e6, threatening knight to c7 check, winning the rook. Rook to b8, check anyway. Rook to c6, and now after the queen moves, d6 is coming as well. Black's king is in terrible trouble. I mean, this is just absolutely overwhelming, just a target practice position. So I think this would have been a very nice way for white to go. So instead, white played bishop to e3. Doesn't hurt anything really. Knight to e5, takes, and now a good move, f4. Absolutely right. We should try to blast the position open. So the only thing that has benefited black a little bit, though, is that now, after takes, his knight gets to f6, which is a good square. Okay, now here I think white makes not a bad move, but like bishop to e3 a few moves ago, and like castling earlier instead of knight to d4, it's a move that's sort of generally useful, but not really to the point. So he played rook a to d1. And, okay, I mean, it puts the rook on a natural file. It protects the d5 pawn. It certainly doesn't hurt white's position. It's better than it was with the rook on a1. But it doesn't really do anything either. So I think a better move would be rook a to e1, preparing d6. And of course, black can't play e6 in response to that because the rook and the queen are ganging up. So for instance, rook to d8, d6, and it's really difficult to see what in the world black is going to do now. He can't develop his bishop with g6 and bishop g7 because rook takes e7 check just wins. e6 loses the queen, not just the pawn, because rook takes e6, king f7, rook to e7 is double check, and, well, okay, actually there's just probably going to be a mate, king g6, queen f7, king f5, bishop c1, queen, anyway, it looks like it's going to be a pretty quick and easy mate, but even if it wasn't, you just grab the queen on d7. So this is just dead loss for black here. I mean, there's really nothing to do in the position. Another idea white could have, let's say the knight retreats with the idea of playing g6 and bishop to g7, and then the knight protects this pawn. Well, if that ever happens, then knight to d5, knight c7 is absolutely fatal. Also, white is probably, well, okay, maybe not, but in some lines, white might be even able to sacrifice his rook on e7 and bring the second rook over to e1, though there knight to g8 can become a relevant factor. But even then, maybe knight to d5 as a follow-up. So black is just completely dead here. So rook a to d1, okay, black played another, I think, well, I just have to say bad move, unfortunately. Takes, knight takes b5, and now knight to c7 check is in the air as well. Rook a5, check, here. Okay, and now I think another good move here, or could have been played. I think what white did was okay. Queen to b8 check. So queen to b8 check, queen c8, and so on. We'll look at that in a moment. But think what white could have done here that's even better. And I think this is a useful theme that white's best move would exemplify here. Though I hasten to say that queen to b8 is perfectly fine, and white should be very easily winning there as well. Okay, well, the answer is the move rook to c1. And, okay, not to insult Krumov, who played a very nice game up to this point. Some improvements were possible, but basically played quite well. But the old phrase, Potzer sees a check, gives a check, comes to mind. So again, there's no insult intended, but it's rather the wisdom contained in this slightly biting aphorism that I want to highlight. And the idea is that very often when we're attacking, and it's not just Potzers, but very strong players too sometimes, who will be in the process of attacking the enemy king and will give a series of checks. And sometimes the result of that is that these forcing moves kind of help the guy. Either they chase the king out to someplace where he's safe, or let the other guy block and maybe muster up a better defense in that way. So here, by playing rook to c1, we put a stop to the queen to c8 idea, because now, okay, let's say it's white's move, queen to b8 check, queen c8, knight e6 check, and we win the queen and the attack rages on. Okay, so that's the threat, and it's not really very obvious what black can even do about it. I mean, how does he stop this check? I mean, he could play queen to c8 now, but knight to e6 check wins the queen. If he plays rook to a8, he's just dropping the rook, and then he still has problems. So this looks like a really killing move here. So, okay, queen to b8 check, queen c8, knight e6, king d7. And, okay, here I think is a final mistake, although white went on to win the game. But, I mean, a final mistake from the standpoint of really trying to crush black quickly. He traded queens. Well, given how much trouble the black king is in, that's really not such an attractive idea. So, a very good move here would just be queen to b6. Two ideas. Of course, one is we just want to keep the queens on the board. And, okay, if rook to a6, simply queen to b5. And now we have a position that really, if you have small children, you should take them away from the chessboard at this point, because the violence that will be done to the black king is unspeakable. There's no place for it to go. Black has to play rook c6, and then you can do basically anything you want to, and it'll destroy black. Okay, well, if black doesn't play rook to a6, well, what is he going to do? The threat is still there to check on b5, and additionally we have the threat of playing rook to c1. So this is just dreadful, and yeah, I mean, there's just nothing really good for black, and nothing to hope for in this position. If he plays rook takes d5, let me figure out what's wrong with this move. Okay, well, let's start with this and see if this works. Just simply piling up. Okay, and if queen is c6, then knight c5 check wins the queen, so that's no good. And if queen is c4, well, queen, no. Okay, so here I have to think for a moment. It's probably something terribly obvious. Okay. Okay, here's an idea. Yeah, knight c5, king e8, queen c6, king f7, queen to e6, king takes e5, king to e8, excuse me, and then, yeah, there's no good back rank check, so rook takes d5 wins, with the point that if queen takes f4, we have rook to d8 check, and then queen to d7 mate. Okay, so it took me a second to figure that one out, but I think that's adequate. Maybe there's something even better, but that seems to do the job. So queen to b6 is basically just a crushing move. We keep the queens on the board, and good things are bound to happen. So again, even if you don't see everything right away, like I didn't, I had to figure out what to do about rook takes d5. Still, with black playing without his bishop on f8, playing without the rook on h8, and with his king in the middle of an open board, great things are going to happen if you're white. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. So again, some of the basic ideas. One is, it's good to look for building up moves, but also you want to look for moves that create direct threats. So again, going back here after f6, knight to d4 is better than just castling because we're immediately trying to exploit this fresh weakness. Here, knight to e4 looks good because it's forcing exchanges that are favorable, and also you're bringing your pieces to more aggressive posts straight away. As you can see, all of white's pieces are functioning beautifully here. Okay, and then later on, rook a to e1 was more to the point, so we go in the open file, we prepare d6, rather than simply defending the pawn. So our position is secure enough. Really what we need to do is find some way to push the other guy over the edge before he can finish his development. And then likewise, a few moves later, rook c1, so again, the avoiding the Potzer sees a check gives a check syndrome. And then finally, when you've got an attack like this, unless you have just an overwhelming material advantage and you just want to finish the game with simple technique, you don't want to trade queens. So other than that kind of case, queen to b6 should be thoroughly decisive. Okay, well, let's go on to the next game. And this is between, I'm not sure if he wants to call himself Yakamura or Jakamura. Presumably it's a tribute to our current U.S. champion against Jinx. And Jakamura is 2100, so a very good player. And I don't believe he gave any notes to the game. But, it has a few interesting moments. So let's take a look. So our submitter was white. And so we have this, I'm not sure who this is named after, this variation with e takes f6. So g takes f6 is the Bronstein-Larsen line. I remember there's a great old Fischer game against Barza, so B-A-R-C-Z-A. This, I believe, is a Hungarian grandmaster. And it was a kind of a beautiful sort of mirror image of the exchange Ruy-Lopez. So Fischer was just able to swap off practically everything and win by utilizing his 4-on-3 queenside majority while black's kingside majority was useless. So I remember that game from when I was a kid. And it's a nice example, but of course theory has moved along since that point, and players with black nowadays can of course put up much more resistance than Barza did. Anyway, c3, bishop d6, bishop d3, castles, queen c2. So this is the standard way of playing this position, and white's aim very often is to play some kind of setup with knight e2, bishop e3, castle long, and then run the h-pawn, especially after black plays g6 to protect his h7 pawn. You could play h6 too, but that seems to leave a lot more gaps over there on the king side. So usually g6 gets played at some point. Now one plan for black also is to play g6 and then f5, and then try to play knight d7, knight f6 very quickly, and not spending time on rook e8 necessarily or anything like that, but just immediately trying to cover all of the light squares over there, and only subsequently go for play elsewhere. So then rook to e8 and bishop to e6 and b5, a5, a4, knight d7, knight b6, and so on. Okay, so there are ways that black can try to play this and get a reasonable game. But anyway, white typically has an advantage, and it's a fairly unpopular line for black. Fairly, but I think it's playable. Okay, anyway, the main move here is rook to e8, although I suggest maybe this g6, f5 right away might be worth considering. Anyway, rook e8, knight e2, g6 here, and then either f5 or knight to d7, and then h5 is a kind of standard continuation. Okay, in the game, black played queen to e7 check, which is a little bit unusual. And then here white played bishop to e3, which is also maybe slightly unthematic. Maybe knight to e2 would be the more typical idea. But okay, bishop to e3. And then here, and actually white did give this variation, which seemed a little strange to me. So he gives bishop to g4, and then knight e2, and he stops here. But I really don't see any reason why white shouldn't take on h7. So after king h8, I think white is just basically a pawn up for nothing. One possible way to continue is h3, driving the bishop away from its good location, and it can't go back to h5 because of g4, and then we win another pawn. So bishop to d7, and then queen to e4, with the idea of swinging the queen to h4 if black doesn't trade queens. And I think black is basically a pawn down for nothing here. So this should be perfectly good for white. So I think f5, well, okay, f5 is again a little bit strange. I mean, I think black is maybe, well, it's just strange in the sense that, okay, black is trying to avoid g6, but if you're avoiding g6, then you really just can't play this variation in the first place. I mean, that's pretty much something that you have to do. It's a responsibility you take on in this knight f6, e takes f6 variation. So anyway, black played f5, and white just grabs the pawn. Thank you very much. Okay, g6. Here white played bishop to d3, which is not bad. Black's bishop is a little bit, well, it's not really a bad bishop because there aren't any central pawns blocking it, but there are a lot of black pawns on light squares. So in a broader sense, it's maybe a very slightly bad bishop. But in any case, I would myself prefer to play just bishop takes c8. It's just a matter of taste. I mean, I think the move played in the game is just fine. White's idea is that he wants to still try to kill black with the usual kingside attack. There's nothing wrong with this idea. Anyway, here I think black should play for some counterplay, and at least try to open the center before white castles and plays h4 and h5 and bludgeons him to death on the king side. So I'd play c5, knight c6. Yeah, and I mean if white castles long, then black is going to have some reasonable chances for counterplay. So I think white would end up having a castle kingside. And alright, he's basically still just a pawn up for free, but at least black is avoiding some troubles that he might face. Well, and that we'll see he does face in the game. Okay, so black played bishop to g4. And again, here I would rather just play h3 than f3. But okay, white wants to play h4, but even so, well, I'll show you what happens in the game. So he plays knight e7, knight e2, queen c7, f3, rook e8, bishop h6, bishop d7, and castles. And certainly white is fine here. I think bishop to e6 is a bit better. We'll come back to this in a moment. But in any case, I think just h3 is fine. So I don't really see any reason not to do this. So h3, knight e2, and okay, if something like bishop c7, hoping for castles, kingside, and then queen to d6, even this is nothing. White just plays bishop to f4, swaps, and is again just a full pawn up with a better position to boot. And okay, I'm sure he can prepare to castle long as well. Anyhow, what white did is okay. I mean, white really has his heart set on this standard attacking plan, and just kind of goes for that. Okay, so queen c7. Yeah, and see, this I think is not so good. So black should just develop his pieces, and maybe play something like b5. Even a move like this can come into consideration, trying to remind white that he too has a king, and if he castles queenside, black will get some counter pressure. So instead, queen to c7 kind of encourages white to do what he wants to do anyway. So f3, rook e8, bishop h6. Okay, and again, I think bishop e6 is better than bishop to d7. I assume he didn't want to do that because it blocks the e-file, but it at least points over at the queen side. So I think this would be a little bit better. Anyway, bishop to d7, castles. Here, again, our protagonist made a little annotation suggesting c5 and then c4, but maybe he just missed bishop to e4, and I think the bishop is safe and white's just plainly winning here. And with the pawn on c4, black has done white a favor by keeping all the queenside lines closed. So anyway, he played rook to c8. Again, might be better to play b5 and push those pawns out there. But really, I mean, I don't see this attack working. It's very easy for white to keep the lines closed on the queen side. The center is... black really has no levers in the center to make anything good happen. And meanwhile, white has very nice pressure on the king side. So this is just a bad position for black. h4, c5. Okay, now white could consider playing... Well, no, you can't really play d5 because then c4, bishop b4, f5. So he plays h5, and this is fine. c4. And now a move I object to a little bit. So white plays bishop takes g6. And, okay, he's still winning, and in fact he won quite convincingly. The game goes something like 44 moves, but I have no idea why. Black was just dead lost for a long, long time. And, well, we'll discuss that in a few moments. But again, bishop takes g6. It doesn't throw away the winning position. White's still winning after hg, f5, and they played a good move, queen to d2, preparing to bring his queen to g5. And he won, a reasonably nice game. But generally speaking, I mean, when you've got such an overwhelming position, I don't really like being dramatic. There's no real reason. So just, I think, a move like bishop to e4. And what does black do? So we're still threatening to sacrifice on g6. So hg and then bishop g6. And let's say black plays something like bishop to c6. Well, we just take. And, okay, if he plays bishop takes e4 to avoid that sack, well, we win a second pawn. And white's position is just overwhelming. I mean, he's up 2 pawns, has this fantastic center. Black's king is still exposed. White's going to play moves like rook d to f1 and e5 and, just whatever he wants to, really. I mean, a check on the g file will just kill black right away. So, I mean, this is absolutely hopeless for black. And white even has the material as well. Okay. And if black plays f takes g6, well, bishop g6. And black can't capture. But again, if he doesn't capture, he's just down 2 pawns with a hopeless position. But this just gets him checkmated. So, no reason to be a hero. You just play bishop to e4 and you can win with your eyes closed. Okay, so in the game, bishop g6, takes, f5, queen e2, a very nice move. Black played bishop to a4, and white made another nice move, queen to g5. And the idea is just to play queen f6 and deliver mate quickly on h8. So black played queen to e7 to prevent this. White again plays very aggressively. Of course, he's threatening the rook, so there's no real sacrifice at the moment. So this, queen h5. And now, okay, again, figure out what white's move should do in this position. So black is down material. He's got a piece, but white has 4 pawns for it in an attack. But, okay, the h-file is closed for the moment, and the knight on e2 is threatened. Well, white played this, bishop to f8. Very nice move. So if rook takes f8, or queen takes f8, then queen to h8 is mate. And what else can black do? So he plays queen to e3 check, king d2, or rook to d2, and king takes f8. Okay, so now he has a flight square, but white was ready for this one too. So he plays queen to h7, and now there's no defense really to g7, g8. Because remember, black also has to stop queen f7 mate. So he played queen e6, here, and okay, I mean really, it's time for black to resign. So he played another 15 moves here, and I have no idea why. So, I was listening to a lecture that Alex Lenderman gave on here, I don't know, probably about a week or so ago. And he said about resigning that, okay, it was appropriate for him to resign when he did in the game against Robeson, but that if it was, let's say, an 1800 playing the game, that he shouldn't resign because it's good to learn from your opponent's technique. But okay, here I think that's really pushing it. I mean, there's not really any technique required, and unless this was a blitz game or something, but I don't think it was. But okay, if it's a blitz game or a 1 minute game, then who cares? But if it's a tournament game, I mean, you're down basically 6 points of material. You have a bad king position. You've got no counterplay, no reasonable prospects for cheapos. You know, it's okay to resign. I mean, it's just okay. It's true that no one ever won a game by resigning, and you can always hope that your opponent dies of a heart attack or something like that. But it's also okay to have a little respect for your opponent too. So I know people differ about this, and you know, if there is any reasonable hope, you should play on. I certainly would accept that. But okay, I mean, it's also a reasonable decision for a couple of reasons sometimes to resign. So one is the sort of general etiquette and respect factor in a tournament game. The other reason is that if you're playing in a Swiss and you've got 2 rounds a day, it's okay to save some energy for yourself too. Get the loss out of your system, get a little rest, or prepare for your next game, and just get the bad game over with. Okay, well anyway, enough about this, and I'm sure some people will tell me that my attitude towards resignation is somehow competitively crazy, but okay, we can disagree about this. Anyway, on to the next game. So this is between NN and Armis, and since Armis had black, we'll flip the board around here. So Armis submitted this game and said he was optimistic about his position at move 14, but ran out of constructive ideas after around move 18. Okay, so let's have a look. All right, so we have a 2 knights, and white played this line with castling, which, okay, it has transpositional value. I'm not sure that's the best transpositional way to handle the position, but okay. Knight takes e4, d4. Okay, and now e takes d4 goes into this well-known canal variation where white temporarily sacrifices a piece and a couple of pawns, but gets almost all of it back, and then plays knight takes e4. So it's kind of a fun line, but you do need to review the theory with both sides. I played it in a tournament about a year and a half ago. Well, no, just about a year ago, a little more than a year ago. Actually, let me take that back again. Yeah, I think it was about a year and a half ago. And I had forgotten the lines. I had prepared some other stuff, but had forgotten this. And I played it against Melakina in one of those I Am Norm tournaments. And speaking of the canal variations, I got a root canal in this game. So I got destroyed. But again, it was just I made an opening mistake, and really there was just nothing to recover from. So she played well, but I more or less gave her a fairly easy game by just forgetting what in the world I was doing. So good game by her, but it's one of these positions where you have to know what you're doing a little bit, and I mixed up some variations and just found myself in the hole and couldn't get out. Anyway, it's like I said, it's dangerous for both lines. In that game, I happened to get killed, but black certainly gets killed sometimes in this too. And I would say probably more often than white does. So I had to do something special to make sure that that result occurred. Anyway, d5 is a different approach. Oh, but I should say, okay, and the usual move order for this is with d4 right away. E takes d4. Sorry. Let me try this again. E takes d4. Castles, of course. Yeah. So like this. And just for your entertainment, and for those of you who like tricky lines, you should know that there's also this even crazier line with knight to c3. So this is even more confusing to look at, but I'm not sure how good it is, but it's possible. So anyway, d takes c4, rook e4 check, bishop e6. Also bishop to e7 is possible. And then, okay, knight takes d4, f5, rook f4, castles, takes, and even though black has all these gruesome looking pawns, he's got an extra, and he's got the bishop here, and white's development doesn't really make an awful lot of sense. Well, actually it doesn't have an extra because it disappears right away. But, okay, I think black is okay with the bishops. Anyway, that's a possible way to play. As I said, bishop to e6 is a possible way to play, and it's just another tricky line. All right, well, anyway, back to our game. So enough of e4, e5 theory. So d5, bishop b5, takes, bishop d7, takes, rook e1, threatening f3. I believe bishop... I'm trying to think if bishop to d6 can be played here. I have this vague feeling that I've seen this, but I might be confusing this with the Riga variation in the two knights or something like that. But yeah, I hadn't looked at this, but the idea would be that, okay, if f3, then there's both queen h4 to be considered, and maybe even just bishop takes h2. So king h2, queen h4 is an immediate perpetual check. Okay, it doesn't mean that you want to play for a draw with black, but theoretically speaking, it's a good result. In other words, the burden is on white to prove something. Okay, and let's think about queen to h4 for a moment. Okay, so if g3, of course we take. And, alright, if queen to e2, well, no, the rook's hanging, so it's got to take. Takes. King h1 is forced. Knight f2 would be mate, but it's slightly illegal. So what can we do with white, or for black, besides give perpetual? Okay, well, one idea is to play queen h4 check. The idea of that, in case you're wondering why not queen h3, is that we want to play bishop to h3. And then the further reason, well, why not bishop to h3 right away, you might ask. Well, sometimes the answer would be rook to g1, but here there's knight to f2. So, but queen to e2, and I think we're at well, maybe we're not at an impasse. So there's bishop to g2, takes, here, queen g1. And, okay, black has a rook and 3 pawns for 2 minors. And, okay, we can consider this with the idea that on this, then, which square? Knight g3 or knight f2? So my thought is essentially to grab this and see where it leads, but probably knight f2 looks better. So knight f2, takes, and so he has to go to g1, of course. Takes, queen takes. Okay, let's say we do this, and now we can take on c2 or swap queens. Alright, well, I suspect with all these pawns, I mean, black should be in good shape here. So that's a possibility. But going back to here, okay, queen h4 check, and king g1, and now bishop to g3. Okay, so again, threatening queen to g3 with mate, and so queen to e2, or queen to d2, for that matter. Looks kind of forced. Alright, and maybe this will turn into the same thing. Maybe there's nothing better than queen g3 and, again, bishop g2. Okay, well anyway, this is a possibility. Let me think here. So on bishop to d6, okay, f3, queen h4. I mean, what else can white play? You could play h3, of course. Now this is really asking for it, though. Queen f2, bishop takes h3. You can't play gh3 because queen h2 is mate. Queen g2 is a mate threat right now. Yeah, I mean this is just got to be hopeless for white. Yeah, so maybe bishop to d6 is an even better move. Unless I'm missing some neat idea here. I mean, this looks like it could be better than theory, or at least than the bishop to e7 move. So okay, maybe I'm missing something big, and I'm sure those of you who analyze more carefully or cheat by using the silicon monster will all let me know if I missed something big. Anyway, bishop e7 happened in the game, f3, and then here I guess in the database there's maybe a couple of games with knight c5, and then f6. I don't really like that move very much, but maybe knight e6, takes, and knight f5 is annoying. So anyway, f6, bishop f4, castles. Black is probably a little bit better here, which just means that white has some compensation for the pawn, but probably not enough. Alright, well in our game, Armas played knight to d6, white played queen to e2, and apparently there's some correspondence game that saw h6 to stop bishop g5, bishop f4, knight c8 to protect the bishop on e7 so that he can castle. But, okay, knight c6, and, okay, this is just strange play by black. White's certainly better here and went on to win. So he's not even down any material. So don't follow that example. Alright, well Armas played king to f8. and this looks reasonable, but again, slightly unpleasant. So, I think white's compensation is probably not enough for the pawn, but it's not bad. It's almost enough for the pawn. And, okay, so let's get a few more moves in. So knight c3, bishop f6, queen f2. Okay, and then here, Armas played this idea with h5 and then h4, and so this is move 14, where he said he felt optimistic, but then ran out of ideas a few moves later. But I think really here is a good place to try to figure out what black should do. Because h5, all right, that's one idea. So he's going to push the pawn, try to create some small weaknesses on white's kingside, and maybe develop the rook by lifting it via h6 or h5. Okay, so again, it's an idea, but not the only idea. So another standard idea would be to try to finish developing everything else first, maybe play rook to b8, hoping to either impede the bishop's development, or if he plays b3, if white plays b3, well, that'll kind of loosen him up on this long diagonal. So actually here I think this is a good positional quiz to try to figure out what white's move ought to do in the position. So take a minute and think about this. Okay, well the answer is a very typical blockading plan. Roman Djindjikhashvili, in a very similar line, except one where white hasn't given away the pawn, really advocates this, and he's kind of promoted this idea for many years. So knight to b3. So we're going to put our pieces in such a way that they really overprotect these dark squares on the queen side and center. So the bishop will go to e3. Maybe the knight will even come to a4. I mean, that's maybe a bit of overkill. And then we drop a knight on the c5 square. And essentially just try to freeze black's pieces. I mean, that freezes pawns, freezes pieces, and leave him without anything whatsoever to do. So if king to g8, also I think white can grab this pawn on a7. And while black is finishing his development, get this pawn rolling down the board a bit. So the queen will come back to f2, and this pawn will just keep on progressing to a7. And I think the position is roughly equal, but it could become easier for white to play very quickly. However, I like this idea of trying to utilize the b file, so maybe the best move is queen to b8 instead. So we'll keep the pawn safe, and we'll bring the queen to b6, where it not only exerts pressure on the b file, but also on the diagonal, and of course there's also this intersection on d4. So I think this gives black some chances. Alright, so one idea might be a3 now. And I think the idea of this is that on queen to b6, let me calculate and make sure about what I'm going to suggest. So I think bishop to e3 works. Yeah. So the point is that after queen takes b2, there's... oh, no, wait. No, maybe it doesn't work. Let's see. So knight here, and the queen can come all the way home. Knight c5, probably bishop to e8, rook here, queen here. Okay, well maybe black can take this material and live. I mean, he's extremely tied down, but maybe there's no disaster ready to be fallen. But I suspect there should be some tactical trick available. Okay, so I don't see anything with knight a4. Queen takes bishop b3, because then the queen can go to h4, or even to e5 maybe. So bishop b3 takes. Okay, knight to b5, and then rook to b1. Doesn't seem to work as a queen c3 after we capture the knight. And if you try sacking the knight, there's no trap either. So I think it's just going to be positional compensation at the end of the day. And it's pretty considerable, but okay, again, it's a battle. I mean, black does have two pawns now. He has almost no activity, but he does have the pawns to keep him warm at night. So this could be interesting as well. I suspect there's probably something better, but that's not so bad. A safer approach is to simply go swapping here like this. But again, as long as white maintains control over the dark squares, he should be okay. If bishop to f5, knight to a6, kind of keeps black tied down. so he can play bishop to c8 and stop that. But alright, I mean, between the opposite colored bishops and the general dark squared clamp, and the fact that it's going to be very, very difficult for black to create a passed pawn on the queen side, white's drawing chances are very, very high. But still, black is safe here and can try to slowly but surely make some progress on the queen side. So, okay, I think this might be the best way to play here with queen to b8. In the game, okay, h5. It's not a bad idea. I mean, I don't think it deserves a question mark or anything, but it is a little bit slow, and it's still not clear even after h4 and rook to h5 whether the rook can fully participate in the game or not. Okay, so knight a4. White continues with his blockading plan. h4, knight c5, h3, g3, and now rook h5. And this, I think, probably isn't best because of bishop to f4, and the rook is not able to really join the battle. So a couple of other ideas. Again, you could play rook to b8, just developing the piece to a good square, especially now that the a7 pawn is not going to be endangered. Another idea is to play knight f5. So we simply try to swap off this active piece. Another idea behind it is that after c3, we don't take, because again that's going to help with the blockade, but play bishop to e7 and then bishop to d6. And if possible, we'll even play c5 if we can do so without losing the pawn back. Okay, so let's say bishop to f4, king g8, knight e5, and alright, I think white has enough activity that he keeps the balance, but black is fine. So he could take, for example, play rook h6, and after the swap, again, black is fine. In fact, here I think black maybe has some chances for an edge. So there's still the same opposite colored bishops and everything, but the pawn on h3 is kind of useful. I mean, it's going to keep white honest as long as the queens are on the board. He can't really do anything too crazy. And, you know, if the f-pawn ever advances, then the bishop goes to e4, and that's fantastic. So, objectively, I mean, I think it's still about even. White can play queen d4, queen c5, and really have very good control over the dark squares. But black does have his chances. Okay, well in the game, rook to h5 happened. Bishop to f4 is a good response. Rook to b8, c3, so the queen protects the pawn on b2. King g8, g4, and then here maybe black misses a small opportunity or two. So here I think bishop h4 is not a bad move. And after bishop to g3, we swap. And if queen takes g3, it's a good little tactic with rook takes b2, because if takes, then rook to g2 is good for black. And on h takes g3, okay, now we go back to h6, and okay, white has to be, doesn't have to be worried really, but should be at least a little bit careful about his king side. And now we no longer have the opposite colored bishop threat either. So white still does have a nice blockade over d4 and c5, and that does give him equal chances, but this blockade could slowly but surely be undermined in some way. Alright, again, nothing really for white to worry about, but black is fine too. Okay, well in the game black played rook to h8, which is okay, rook a to b1, and now again I think bishop to h4 is better. So king to h7 is a little bit inaccurate. Now white plays queen to g3, and this pawn is hanging. Now I think black should have played rook to e8, and just completed his development in kind of a normal way. He loses the h-pawn, but it's not the end of the world, and now at least black's pieces kind of make good sense. So instead he played bishop to h4, and here's a little bit awkward. So queen h3, king g8, and after bishop to g3, see the thing is I don't really think that black's rook has too much to do on the h-file. So I think this is a little bit nicer for white than the position after rook to e8, and then queen h3, king g8. Okay, so here black retreated, queen g2, and now he just made a blunder. A natural one, very understandable, but blunder nonetheless. So he played knight to b7, understandably wanting to get rid of this blockading knight on c5, but the problem is bishop takes c7. And after this, after queen c7, the bishop on e7 is hanging, but also there's first knight to a6. So knight a6, and white's winning decisive material, and the game ended shortly, or at least he only gave a few more moves. Okay, so what can be said about this, generally speaking? I would agree that it's tough to find a good plan even back here, or let's go to this position. So I'm already feeling a little bit frustrated for black, or if not frustrated, then concerned to find some promising approach already back here. So h5, h4 is interesting. It's okay. It's one way to continue, though it's not really a full solution or a real full way of handling what's going to be coming up in the game. So I think probably the best approach is just queen to b8 and queen to b6, trying to fight for these dark squares over on the queen side, activating the queen here, and well, I think that looks like the best approach to me. It doesn't give black anything big, but I don't really think there is anything big to be had in the position. So I think white has good compensation. So yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, and a very good kind of position to try to work out. So this would be my best solution here. Okay, and then again, for those of you who like to analyze, I'm definitely curious about bishop to d6 to see if there's anything major that I missed here. So this looks like it should be good, though. I don't really see any big punishment, and if there isn't, then this should be played, because the bishop is definitely better on d6 than on e7. We just castle the next move. We have a free extra pawn, good development, and life is just good in general. So, okay, let me see if there's one more game to look at, or if I'm caught up. Yep, there is one more game. So we've gone pretty long, but I'll brave it and hope that you'll be patient with me. Okay, so this is between Bernober, I guess. I'm sure that's not his actual name. Maybe it's short for Bernardo. But anyway, he's the one who submitted it. He was white in this game, had an extra pawn, but failed to win it. And so he was kind of curious about it. And I think this game actually is in some ways an interesting complement to the one that we just looked at, because in both cases, the player who submitted the game was up a pawn, went on to lose. And I think in both cases, maybe, I'm not sure, but I mean, I get the sense that in both cases, the player with the extra pawn overvalued it and really felt as if that pawn should have led to a win, pretty much by virtue of the extra pawn, that essentially everything else was okay. So let's have a look at this one. So we've got a closed Sicilian, slightly strange development by black, but not that strange. Okay, and now it's some normal plans come into play. White is building up on the king side, black is going on the queen side. But here I'm a little surprised by b3. I mean, it just looks like knight takes b5 should be fine. Now, sometimes if you open up lines for the opponent's pieces on the side of the board like this, like in a Benko gambit, it can backfire. But here I think this is just, I mean, black maybe gets a little play for it, but not much. I think black already has play on the queen side. So it's not as if the choice was between black having nothing on the queen side and now black developing an initiative there. So I think this should have been done. So anyway, b3 happened. Here black I think should play b4, but played c4. And after c4, this time white took. But I think this time it's not so impressive, because here this b3 pawn is backward. The d3 pawn is a little bit loose, so you could see, for instance, in some lines with knight to b4 and maybe bishop to a6, that it might not be so difficult for black to achieve some pressure against this guy. So here I really don't think that white has very much. And in fact, with knight to d7, I think black is in very good shape. And if white's not careful, he could even end up being worse, because this knight is ready to come to c5, where it hits this guy, it hits this guy. Okay, the knight's under attack, and if it leaves, there's more pressure against b3. Again, bishop to a6 might happen after knight to c5, with more pressure against d3. Maybe the knight can come to b4. So you can see, I mean, it's just very easy for all of these black pieces to come flying into the action. And this is very different from what we had back here if white plays knight takes b5. So here there's no weak b pawn at all. The d3 pawn isn't weak at all. If black plays c4, white plays d4, and life is just good. So this is a much better version for black. Okay, well here black should have played knight to d7 as I just said, but played bishop to d7. Okay, now here our protagonist suggested knight f to d4 instead of the move he played, which was the other knight to d4. But I think this is wrong. I think he played better in the game than in his annotations, because here after knight f to d4, knight to b4, these white knights are a little bit loose. So I think knight b to d4 is much better. The knights are far more secure here. So now knight to b4 just really wouldn't mean much because there's no knight on b5 under attack. So okay, black played queen to c7. And alright, so I should say, I think bishop to d7 was a serious inaccuracy. The bishop really doesn't do anything useful there, whereas knight to d7 allows black's pieces to find all of their best squares on the queen side. So after bishop to d7, now I think white does have close to a free extra pawn. Okay, so queen c7. And so here I think we can start to think schematically in terms of what it is white should do. And essentially, I think the basic plan is to continue the development and to do so in such a way that you're ready, willing, and able to swap pieces. So for instance, I think knight takes c6 is pretty good. Bishop c6, bishop to e3. We're not going to take on b6, so we're not going to go with the bishop here. We're just finishing development, opening the c file, taking more control over squares like d4 and c5. And after rook f to c8, then we can play rook f2. And the plan will be to double on the c file, and then maybe play knight to d4. And I think with that executed, white is in very good shape. So the knight on d4 is well placed. It covers the b3 pawn, so there's not really too much pressure to be had against that. Black's knight on b6 has no forward squares. It's dominated by white's b pawn. The bishop on e7 has no targets. The bishop on c6 is a bad bishop. And when the rooks are double on the c file, all of the heavy pieces are likely to disappear quickly as well. So this looks like a very good way for white to handle the position. Alright, in the game, white played bishop to a3, which I think is reasonably motivated. Maybe not the best move, but reasonably motivated. The reason why I'm a little unsure is because maybe after a couple of exchanges, the rook is kind of klutzy on a3. There may not be any way to immediately take advantage. For instance, if queen to c5, then white plays queen to a1. So everything is guarded, and now he's ready to play rook to a5 or rook to c1. So I don't really think that's that great for black. And likewise, queen to c3, queen a1 is again pretty good. Black can maybe take the d3 pawn. I'm not sure if he can survive, because it looks like almost all of the escape routes are covered. So on queen takes d3, maybe f5 and then rook to d1 or b4. I mean, it's pretty scary looking. I'm not sure if there's a knockout blow, but it's pretty close. Anyway, white is certainly better here. But I think after something calm like rook f to c8, preventing white from using the c file, black is again in comparatively good shape. I mean, he's worse, but not much worse. Okay, but anyway, black played rook f to e8. White took, absolutely right. Swapped again, and now played queen to c2, which I don't really like as much. So I would prefer just knight to d4. So we put the knight on this good square right away. But okay, it doesn't really matter. Queen c2 is fine. Queen b7, knight to d4. Okay, and now here though I don't like what white did. So this is a good place, again, to stop for a moment and figure out what white's move should do. Well, I think the rule of thumb about rooks going on open files is completely right. And something like rook f to c1, I think, is just the way to play here. So we don't let black take over the c file. We can neutralize it at worst. So instead, though, white played rook f to b1. Black played rook to c7. Thanks for the file. Queen d2. Of course, white's still in fine shape, but really this rook on b1, I mean, you can't push the pawn very far. I mean, it can go to b5, and that's as far as it's going to go for now. So I think it's a much better idea. Not that this hurts white. I mean, white is still fine, but I think taking over the files first, swapping if the situation becomes available, and you can exchange without giving up too much ground, and only then making further progress. I think this would be the way to go. So, okay, here's we'll see black gets play, and white's b-pawn never really gets that far up the board. So knight c8, b4. f5 is actually, f5 is actually a strong move, as Bernober points out. And it's kind of coincidental, though. So, I mean, it's sort of one of these things where, hey, look what I found. Because all the play has been on the queen side, and it suddenly transpires that white has very dangerous attacking possibilities on the king side. Moves like f6 and queen g5 coming up. But, okay, that's just sort of a one-time only deal. So instead he played b4, queen b6, attacking the knight, knight c2. So you can see white's pieces are going backward. He hasn't made progress, he isn't swapping anything off, and his b-pawn isn't going anywhere, especially after knight a7. So he plays here, which looks reasonable, knight to b5, but now another kind of strange move. He plays rook to b3. So, okay, of course that stops the fork with knight to c3, but it would make more sense, I think, just to double on the a file, and that also takes care of the fork possibility while activating the rooks. So rook to b3 is, again, kind of an unfortunate move. I mean, it doesn't really, not only does it not double, but it prevents white from doubling because the knight would cover the a3 square. So now black, of course, doubles on the c file, and all of a sudden, I think black is just equal here. I mean, black is really, well, all of his pieces are pretty good. White's extra pawn is thoroughly blockaded, and none of white's pieces really makes a very good impression except for the rook on a2. So the rook on a2 is usefully posted, although it's tied down to this defensive task of protecting the knight. So white's queen is passive, the bishop on g2 is doing nothing, the rook on b3 is really passive, the knight on c2 is passive. So everything's kind of gone wrong here. It's not lost yet, but he quickly is. So for instance, he plays knight a3, which is another error. Again, better just to activate the pieces, challenge black's pieces, and okay, here we offer a swap. So queen to e3 would have been good. If the queen retreats, then our knight can go back to d4, put it on an active square. And if black trades, well, we recapture, and again, at least we've traded the queens, and we can start to hope that we can use our material advantage down the road. Alright, instead white played knight to a3, and now really bad things start to happen. So rook to c1, and the threat is queen g1 mate. So the rook on b3, I mean, it's really costing white several ways. Alright, it's already kind of tough. It would have been better for him to play h4 probably, but he played g4. And now, okay, check here, and white is really in trouble here. So see if you can figure out what black's best move is in this position. So we end up with a really nice, practically zugzwang position in this this sideline. Okay, well, the move played in the game is knight to c3, and black remains significantly better after this. But it would have been even better to play knight to d4. Okay, our player here recommends rook to b1, or mentions rook to b1, but of course, black just takes the piece and is winning. So the principal defense for white is rook b to b2, trying to keep the material. So now, rook to f1, and actually he mentions this too. Okay, so now we're threatening rook f3, also maybe knight f3, so king h4, rook f3, and okay, if bishop takes f3, this is, yeah, he gives this line, knight f3, king h5, and then f6 is mate. Okay, so of course white shouldn't volunteer for something like that. So let's consider a move like b5, and now try to figure out how black finishes this position off. So it's amazing, actually, if we go back here for a second, you look and see, I mean, there's nothing for white to move. I mean, it's really a pretty disgusting position. I mean, he can't move his knight anywhere, really. The rooks have no scope. They can go to the back rank. That's about it. His bishop can't move without being lost, or without, well, even if he takes on f3, the bishop's lost, and he gets mated, or loses the queen. His queen is pretty much stuck. I mean, it's just horrible. So anyway, b5, and now the winning move is queen h2. So threatening queen to g3, and then king h5, f6 mate, and on queen to e1, rook h3, and then knight f3, and again f6 mate. So pretty gruesome stuff here. And you'll see, I mean, by letting white's or black's rooks live, all of this became possible. So we let so back to this position. So we let we let black use the C file rather than contesting it much earlier. We let black's queen stay on this long diagonal instead of playing queen to e3 here to kick it out. And we could have had the knight and kept the knight on d4, but we retreated it. And so you can see, I mean, all of these backward moves, and the only forward move was rook b1 to b3, and that weakened the back rank. So, again, going back here to this position. Okay, here, I mean, you can see, I mean, black has no play at all in the position. So again, his knight is awful, his bishop's awful, and white controls the open file. So with rook f to c1, there's just nothing for white to fear at all. So let's say something like rook to c8. Okay, this makes sense. Just any kind of common sense move here, I think, should be fine. Probably queen to d2. Okay, this looks reasonable, with the idea of bringing the queen to a square like b4, or maybe to a5. And okay, let's say black doubles. Alright, that's okay. We can probably just take. Queen takes, otherwise if rook takes we could play rook to c1. And now, okay, among other possibilities, we could play maybe queen to b4. Yeah, so I mean this looks pretty reasonable. So if queen to c3, oh no, actually maybe queen to c3 gives a little counterplay, because we can't take the knight because the rook is hanging. Alright, so takes. Well, even here, okay, bishop to f1, and there's no way for black to make any further progress. So it'll just take a few moves, but we just bring our king over, evict the rook, and there's nothing for the rook to do. So you can see the knight can't help really. Well, actually, yeah, there might be a race. So knight to d7. Let's see if the knight can help out in time. I don't think it can, but we should at least test it. So king g1, knight c5, rook a8, king f8, and now knight to b5, rook takes, knight d6. Okay, so that's not acceptable for black. But you know, what else is he going to do? And in fact, that's just a problem anyway. We don't even need to play king g1. We can do this immediately. Here, whoop, hello. How did that happen? Sorry about that. Rook a8, king f8, knight to b5, and this just wins straight away. Oh yeah, that's right. That was the difference. Check. Here, king e7. Well, but actually knight to d6 anyway. Knight f6, takes, and you can take the bishop, or even better, make a new queen. So, yeah, this looks like a pretty natural way to play. And alright, if that queen to c3 doesn't achieve anything, then white's just in great shape here. Alright, so I think the point's been made. So, you know, keep your pieces active, trading, or at least being open to trades, putting your pieces on good squares, and if they happen to be traded off, that's okay. Not going out of your way, not making big concessions for exchanges, but basically allowing the exchanges to occur is alright. And you know, the first order of business always, when you've got a material advantage and everything else is kind of normal, is to make sure that your opponent doesn't get play. And so giving up the file like this is really not a good way. So we gave up a file, now we gave up some space, and then we gave up the back rank, and you can see we let black in. Alright, so this has been a very long show now, and I should definitely stop at this point, and I will see you all next time. So thanks a lot, and good night.